Good evening. My thanks to the court service for inviting me to talk here in this most historic place at this most historic time. I want to tell you the story through photographs of one of the most crucial happenings in modern Irish history, the first action of the Irish Civil War, which took place here at the forecourts of Dublin on 28th of June, a century ago. By the time the war had petered out 11 months later, Ireland had lost major figures such as Michael Collins, Liam Lynch, Arthur Griffiths, and Liam Mellows, and a shadow had been cast over the political, cultural, and economic development of our country for many decades. Let me take you back to Dublin on Wednesday, the 28th of June, 1922. It dawned humid and misty, with drizzling rain blurring the yellow tram standard lights. The streets were not empty, however. They echoed with the tramp of marching men as hundreds of troops of the new National Army converged on the forecourts and took up positions in buildings circling the complex. Two 18-pounder field guns, handed over by the British to Emmett Dalton at Marlborough Barracks, were manhandled to sites across the river from the courts, one at the bottom of Bridge Street and the other at Wine Tavern Street. At 3:40, a message was delivered to the officer in charge of the forecourts, ordering the evacuation of the buildings or face an attack. The message was ignored, and at about 4 a.m., the National Army opened fire on the courts from all sides, and the Irish Civil War had begun. This diagram shows how thoroughly the courts campus was surrounded. In 1916, when the forecourts were also occupied, they held out against the British because they put defense posts in the surrounding streets leading to the forecourts. In 1922, little was done to defend the courts against attack. The garrison didn't even occupy the Forecourts Hotel, which proved to be a Trojan horse when it was occupied by the National Army before the fighting even began. You can see the Forecourts Hotel down on the left-hand side of the campus. Let's step back for a moment to the night of April 15th, 1922. The iconic forecourts, designed by James Gandon, had graced the Liffey in Dublin City and housed the premier courts of Ireland since 1803. On that April night, an anti-treaty IRA force broke into the courts and established their national headquarters there. The reason they gave for taking over the buildings was that their old headquarters in Parnell Square was not big enough for their needs. But it was also very much about provoking the provisional government and perhaps wrecking the treaty by drawing the British into conflict again. The buildings were minimally fortified with sandbags, the windows filled with heaps of law books, and all the entrance gates were blocked and armed sentries were posted. The leader of the occupation was Commandant General Rory O'Connor, IRA Director of Engineering and a veteran of the 1916 rebellion. He was particularly outspoken in opposition to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and he did not rule out the idea of a military dictatorship running Ireland. He stated that the IRA knew what was best for the Irish people. In April 1922, the forecourts shared a spacious campus with the Solicitors' Block, which also housed the probate and divorce courts, the Land Registry Office, and the Public Records Office, seen here on the left, where priceless documents and records, many centuries old, were carefully stored. For the young men of the anti-treaty IRA, the accommodations provided in the forecourts must have seemed quite luxurious compared to what they were used to when fighting a guerrilla war against Britain. And there were young men, some of them only boys. Here's 20-year-old Joe McHenry standing on top of the dome. Must have been a frightening thing to do. The anti-treaty IRA men, unlike the new National Army, received no pay, and they were maintained by requisitioning food and clothing from shops. Their army also needed cash. And during the month of May 1922 alone, they requisitioned over £156,000 from 26 banks around the country. and that figure would be about 83 million in today's money. Apart from providing barracks accommodation for the men, the buildings of the Four Courts campus were used for other purposes. The Public Records Office on the left was converted into a munitions factory for the manufacture of hand grenades and landmines. The solicitors' block behind the main building became the headquarters block of Óglaigh na hÉireann, and senior members of the IRA executive took over plush judges' offices there. A large store of explosives for use in the munitions factory was established in the west end of the new headquarters block. The main Four Courts building provided barracks accommodation and spaces for meetings. Headquarters canteen was located there, but it said the food was so bad that most people went out for their meals. During the 2 months of occupation, concerts were held here in the space of the central hall of the Four Courts to entertain the men, and outside it attended by invitation. Since January, negotiations had been going on between the anti and pro-treaty military wings to try to find a formula that would unite them again. Here are some of those who took part in those meetings. Pro-treaty Sean McKeown is the only one in uniform over there on the left. Two on the anti-treaty side, Liam Mellows on the right and Liam Lynch, third from the right, were to die violent before a year was out. For fear of disrupting these talks, however, the occupation of the courts, an act of extreme provocation, was not immediately addressed by the provisional government. In addition, the new National Army were still in training, and they were not thought strong enough just yet to take on the IRA, which greatly outnumbered the numbers in the National Army. The provisional government were, however, losing patience, and by mid-June 1922, matters began to escalate. 18th of June, a split occurred in the anti-treaty IRA. Liam Lynch on the left, who might be regarded at this stage as a moderate, resigned as Chief of Staff of the IRA, and one of the Four Courts men, Joe McKelvey, was elected in his place. On the 22nd of June, 1922, the former British Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson was shot down in the street in London by two members of the IRA. The British government was furious, believing incorrectly that Rory O'Connor and those in the Four Courts were responsible for this outrage. This is Alfred Cope, Britain's chief civil servant in Ireland. On the 23rd of June, Arthur Griffith and General Emmett Dalton of the new National Army met with him. And among the matters discussed was the transfer of artillery to the National Army. On the 24th of June, Lloyd George wrote to Michael Collins, "Mr. Rory O'Connor cannot be permitted to remain with his followers and an arsenal in open rebellion in the heart of Dublin. Bring it to an end forthwith." On the same day, the British cabinet ordered General Neville Macready, who was commander of the remaining British troops in Ireland, to end the occupation of the Four Courts by military force. Macready put together a plan of attack, but he managed to persuade the cabinet that this was exactly what the anti-treaty IRA wanted to happen, and any such attack by him would unite the Irish and restart the war. After a pause, the cabinet rescinded the order, but matters were now swiftly moving towards civil war. On Monday, 26th of June, the requisitioning habits of the anti-treaty IRA had, up until now, been ignored by the provisional government, but patience was running out. When Leo Henderson of the anti-treaty IRA was in the process of requisitioning lorries from a garage in Bagot Street, a force of National Army troops arrived to stop him. This is the moment of their arrival. And you can see even the little baby in the pram down there is taking it all in curiously. Henderson, anyway, was arrested and he was lodged in Mountjoy jail. And that evening, the leadership in the forecourts, enraged by the arrest of Henderson, decided to retaliate. They went out and they kidnapped General O'Connell, that's General Ginger O'Connell, the second in command of the National Army, and took him back as a prisoner to the forecourts. And this was the last straw for the provisional government, already under pressure from the British. And knowing that there had been a split in the anti-treaty IRA, it was decided that this was a good time to make a move against Rory O'Connor. Feeling confident the army was ready, the cabinet decided to evict the anti-treaty IRA from the forecourts by force if necessary. On Tuesday, 27th of June, 24-year-old General Ebbet Dalton was selected to command the move on the courts. In spite of his youth, he was an experienced soldier, having seen action in the Great War, won the Military Medal for Valor, and after the war had spent 3 years fighting in the War of Independence. Dalton was convinced that if artillery were used on the forecourts, while it wouldn't necessarily cause significant damage, it would terrify the forecourts garrison. Late evening on June 27th, this is Liam Mellows, who was one of the senior officers in the forecourts in the anti-treaty IRA. He seemed to know that an attack was going to take place very, very soon, within hours. So he organized to have all of the money that had been collected, plus all of the headquarters materials, taken from the forecourts to a safe place. Now, where was the safe place, you might ask? Well, the safe place was the Capuchin Friary, just up the road. As you can see the dome of the forecourts just past it on the right-hand side, just past the church on the right-hand side in this particular picture. That's where the money was going. And you might ask, why was it going there? Well, here are two Capuchin priests who are based in that particular priory, and they were the two men who were giving spiritual assistance to the garrison of the forecourts. A request for a priest having been turned down by the Archdiocese of Dublin. But on the right here, Father Dominic O'Connor wasn't only a Capuchin priest. He was also a senior officer in the IRA. And this is a picture of him in full uniform. So certainly when the money went to Father O'Connor, Liam Mellows knew it was going to a safe place. Early morning on the 28th of June, the artillery gunners were ordered to spread their barrage across the front of the buildings to make sure everybody was aware of the heavy fire. But the men carried out their work to the absolute limit. But eventually, it was found that the lads inside weren't, in fact, bothered at all by the gunfire. I think they were probably all crouching in the cellars while the gunfire was taking place. Just to show how well they had done in the first hour or two in spreading those artillery shells across the facade of the forecourts. Every red dot here is a shell hit. So you can see the artillery men, who were complete amateurs, they'd never fired these guns before, did very well when they were operating them. I have mentioned before the youth of the combatants, and this is 21-year-old Padraig O'Connor of the National Army, who was in charge of the attack from the Church Street side. As no serious attempt had been made to fortify the forecourts, as has been done in 1916, Commandant O'Connor was able to station a machine gun on top of the tower of St. Michael's Church, overlooking the entire forecourts complex. And this is the view that they would have had from the top of the tower. You can see right in front of you the modern building that has replaced the Public Records Treasury, and behind you can see the dome and the rest of the forecourts buildings. When the battle started, they were able to rake all the rooftops of the forecourts with lethal fire. And this had a strange effect. The inexperienced young men who were garrisoning the Public Records Office and the Records Treasury used all their sandbags up on the roof, and that's where they crouched, ready to fire down into the streets at any attacking infantry, not realizing they were overlooked by St. Michan's Tower. The shooting from St. Michan's Tower drove them all off the roof, and they had to get down inside the building again. And of course, at that stage, they were under fire from what was the Four Courts Hotel, where the red brick building on the left-hand side is in this particular image. And you can see how close the windows are to the windows in the Public Records Office, where the young men had been driven. And they had no sandbags in the windows at that level. So they went through the fireproof doorways into the record treasury and brought out armloads of priceless documents, piled them in the windows to protect themselves. Strangely enough, at the end of the whole affair, after the records treasury had burnt out, these documents, still reasonably well intact, were the only documents to survive the fire. It was a strange business, a strange battle, I should say, a strange battle. An unusual battle. There was a large audience watching everything that happened during the course of the battle for the 3 days, lined up along the Liffey, and it was an extremely well photographed battle as well, and in fact also filmed for Pathé News. And another thing that was unusual about this, there was an almost universal disinclination on behalf of participants on both sides to cause any injury to their opponents, who had been staunch comrades mere months before in the war against the British. Dr. Jim Ryan, one of the doctors attending to Four Courts casualties, wrote a note to his wife telling her not to worry, that the attackers were not trying to shoot to kill. Although Commemorating had aligned themselves with the anti-treaty IRA, they were regarded with great respect by both sides, and they were allowed full access to the Four Courts, where they assisted with the injured and by bringing in medical supplies. Moira Comfort, this is the lady with the great big grin in the middle of this group, was told by a National Army soldier that he was afraid that the lads inside were running out of ammunition, so he gave her a pocket full of rifle bullets to bring into them. What a strange battle. On one occasion, however, a National Army officer in the cordon outside became suspicious of two nurses wanting access to the courts. And he was right, because one of them, he discovered, dressed up in his wife's nurse's uniform, was the West Cork Flying Column leader, Tom Barry. Dear, sorry about that now. It was decided eventually that the artillery was not going to frighten the garrison out into the street to surrender. And it was decided that they had to be more definite about what they were doing. And the gun crews were given orders to create two breaches in the walls of the western end of the Four Courts, so that an infantry assault could take place. One gun was placed in Hammond Lane, and the other gun was the one in Bridge Street. And they were to punch holes in the Records House in one case, and in the West Pavilion at Morgan Place in the other case. And they did extraordinarily well. And you can see from this image the hole that they created in the west wing of the at Morgan Place. But you have to remember that the building to the left of that damage is actually the headquarters of the attacking force. Their own men, in other words, were in that building. And the other thing to note is that there is a telegraph pole directly in front of them. If the shell had hit that, it would have blown back and caused injuries to themselves. So they did a pretty good job to create that breach. And here's the breach just after it was completed. Men ran up this breach and from the Four Courts Hotel, climbing up a scree of rubble and burst inside the building. Joe Leonard, the officer in charge of that particular attack, was wounded on the way in. And in the dust, and you can see the dust here, the dark and the terrifying frenzy of close quarters fighting, 3 National Army men were killed. By evening, however, much of the west wing of the forecourts was in National Army hands. You can see here what little concern was shown by the National Army about the Public Records Office. Simultaneously with the Bridge Street gun creating a breach at Morgan Place, the 18-pounder at Hammond Lane punched this hole in the records house. And after the last shells had been fired, Padre O'Connor and his men ran down Hammond Lane through the gap of the railings, crossed the debris and into the building, shooting as they went. In this case, however, the garrison of the Public Records Office were terrified, huddled in a room far away from the shell fire as possible, and they made little resistance and surrendered. 2 of them, however, tried to run away and were shot trying to escape, it is said. Tom Wall and John Cusack, both 18-year-olds, and this is the young Tom Cusack. The capture of the Public Records Office saved it, maybe only briefly, from a deliberate attempt to burn it. The garrison commander, Paddy O'Brien, had said that he would blow up or burn the forecourts rather than hand them over. Witnesses state that days before the attack, barrels of paraffin and petrol were distributed for this purpose. I had read accounts of holes being made in the floors of the records house and sheets hung down to assist the fast spread of flame when this building was starting to burn. And in fact, it wasn't only very recently, when I blew up this particular photograph, I could quite clearly see, as you can now, in the middle of that breach, you can see a tattered sheet hanging down to confirm that this was the case. They were going to burn it anyway. Early Friday morning, the National Army were in possession of the Public Records Office and the west wing of the forecourts, and they were pushing forward to the central hall. The garrison had retreated back into the east wing of the forecourts. At about 11:30 on Friday morning, a fire started in the abandoned solicitors or headquarters block. In this photograph taken from Wine Tavern Street, you can see the smoke rising behind the main building. The National Army troops were just about to move out of the Public Records Office to capture the headquarters block when there was a tremendous explosion, creating an enormous mushroom cloud, out of which fell like a snowstorm fragments of documents from the probate courts and the divorce courts. And in the explosion, the west end of the headquarters block was completely destroyed. This is where the store of munitions was, and this is what in fact created the explosion. The south wing of the Land Registry Office was destroyed as well, and there was some damage done to the east wall of the records treasury. Padre O'Connor's men, who, remember, are in that records house and the records treasury, all survived, except with minor injuries from flying glass and broken glass. O'Connor's men evacuated the buildings, and by 1 p.m. the rest of the National Army troops had evacuated the west wing and the central hall for fear of more explosions. Although the explosion caused no fatalities, after it really, the combatants on both sides were in such shock that fighting more or less ceased. In the basement of the east wing, a decision was made to surrender. After destroying their weapons, the anti-treaty IRA garrison marched out onto the quays and were taken under guard by troops with fixed bayonets to a temporary holding space at Jameson's distillery. And the first action of the Civil War was over. But assisted by the explosion, the fires spread. And although the main building and the east and west wings were still free of fire by Friday afternoon, no firefighting seems to be taking place. Note the fire tender parked here on the quay in front of the main building. And here it is a couple of hours later, still in position. with its lather and all still in position, but no moves made to tackle the fire. At about 6 p.m., the interior of the dome was afire, and at around 7 p.m., the great iconic copper dome collapsed into the building. The fires continued to rampage and spread to the east wing. Even after the dome had collapsed, this Pathé News clip, it's a still from a Pathé News clip. It shows a journalist holding onto his hat inside the main building. In the background is the central hall with where we sit this evening, heaped high with the debris of the collapsed dome. There are no fire brigade men there. Why does it seem that no serious attempts were made on behalf of Dublin Fire Brigade to tackle the fires? One of the excuses was that there was still unexploded ordnance among the buildings on the campus. But what about fighting the fires from the streets? Here you can see in this particular image taken from across the river, on the left-hand side, you can see the records treasure with plumes of white smoke pouring out of it. And that facade you see faces onto Church Street. And here is looking up Church Street today, with the building in the foreground. There is the modern building that replaced the Treasury. Surely the fire in the Records Treasury could have been tackled from the street, from Church Street, without any great danger to the firemen pouring water on. Now, it wouldn't have saved all the material, but surely a lot of water dampened material, water damaged material would have been better than simply the ash that eventually resulted. As I say, the fire brigade had plenty of suitable up-to-date equipment and pumps at the time, and ladders similar to this one, they were available for hours, and the buildings were just allowed to burn. This is Captain Myers, Captain John Myers, Dublin Fire Brigade Chief. His report on the matter stated that the brigades left Tara Street at about noon, and on arrival, we found that the fire had originated apparently in the records office and was extending to the entire building. Now, this is clearly not correct. He also says the flames could be seen spreading to the dome surmounting the central hall. Also not correct. This didn't happen until late in the afternoon, as proved by other photographs. He says that his men were in the complex working at putting out the fire until 3:15 p.m. when a landmine exploded and 3 men were injured. He then withdrew his men for fear of more explosions. But I wonder why, during the 3 hours that they were in the complex, so little was achieved. Strangely, Myers made no mention whatever of the great explosion. And this is Myers' map of the destruction that occurred in the forecourt site. The only substantially surviving building, the Land Registry Office, is not shown at all. It's not actually shown on the plan at all. It should be north of the Solicitor's block there. The Records House also survived the fire, but that's not indicated. His reporting, Myers' reporting, seems to amount to quite a lot of misinformation. We know, however, that by 1922, Myers had a history of turning a blind eye to the activities, or should I say inactivities, of members of the fire brigade. There were a number of occasions when the brigade refused to deal with fires that had been started by the IRA. Is this the answer? This photograph shows members of Dublin Fire Brigade at the time. Many fire brigade men had fought in 1916. Some were members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the IRA, while others were members of the Irish Citizen Army, which was allied with the anti-treaty IRA. These members were very active on behalf of the anti-treaty garrison during the battle, carrying dispatches in and out of the courts by ambulance. Joe Connolly, the second from the right, was a Citizen Army member and an ambulance driver, and he spirited away from the forecourts the injured garrison commander, Paddy O'Brien, to prevent his arrest. O'Brien lived on to fight in Wicklow and Wexford afterwards, before being killed in Enniscorthy in July. So when the fires eventually burnt out, this was what was left of the main forecourts building without a stone, and the wings on either side. About 30 meters south of the, this particular one is the actual explosion site, right where the materials were stored at the end of the headquarters block. In the background there, you can see the destroyed south wing of the the Land Registry Office. And this photograph shows the rubble of the headquarters block. And behind you can see the burnt out records treasury with the tortured, twisted, burnt steel that supported the entire structure at the time. And this is the truncated end of the solicitor's block. Here's the central hall where I'm giving this talk this evening. The remains of the copper and structure and columns of the roof litter the floor. And finally, the records treasury from the inside. You can see the steel. The building was built to resist fire. There was no timber inside. All the structure was steel, but you can see that when a fire gets going, the records themselves created huge heat and destroyed the steel. So one wonders, it's a wonder that all of the ruins that were there weren't in fact bulldozed as the OPW engineer at the time had recommended. But one of those that ensured that we still have the forecourts today was T.J. Byrne, Chief Architect of the Office of Public Works at the time. The current Chief Architect, Ciaran O'Connor, will now go on to tell you how the forecourts were saved. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to the Chief Justice and the Court Service for asking me. I'm going to take a slightly, I know, because I know a lot of people know information, so I'm going to take a slightly different angle on things. I'm going to take a thing of, if maybe the first slide. That's it, yeah. Yeah. So what I'm talking about here is a mosaic of history and culture, and it's not always neat and uniform. It's often fractured and disfracted. And what has happened, and I've taken it as both a personal, because my grandfather was involved, and if you think of my predecessor in OPW, was responsible for fixing it. So I'm going to take you through a personal family history and of what happened with T.J. Byrne and how he got this building rebuilt and other things he did. This is my grandfather on your left-hand side, and it's often a thing of two classes. You have a working class man from Dorset Place, and you have a man from England of Irish parentage on his father's side. His mother, Harriet, had him in 1876. His father was originally from Baltinglass, served in the British Army throughout the Empire, came back to England and joined the Surrey militia. And shortly after T.J. Byrne being born, he died, and his wife remarried. And lucky for T.J., she did, because she married someone with much more wealth. And as a result, T.J. Byrne was able to be articled to an architect in London. And what the article means is he paid to be trained. So he was trained for 4 years. So his family had paid for him for that. What he was a poetic pragmatist, and I think I'll illustrate that in the talk, and he deserves the recognition that he has not yet got for what he did. He did, for almost 20 years, heroic work on many things. Dublin Airport, to name but a few, all the national schools that were done at the time, the new Garda stations, as well as these key public buildings. And I had the luck of meeting his grandson, John, before he died, and I had lots of talk with him on 3 occasions. And he gave me lots of the information I'm going to share with you, as well as the research I've done in the OPW files about the rebuilding of this building. And I just show a little bit more about my grandfather. He took part in the 1916 Rising as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old, got caught, brought up to the Garden of Remembrance, and he looked so young that the British officer gave him a root in the arse and said, "Go home to your mammy," of which he never forgave that officer for, because he said, "I was humiliated among my own people." And he was a lovely man, my grandfather, when I knew him, and I think he was also when he was younger. So he also knew Mirish McGonigal up in Ballykinder detention camp, and I've had the luck of working with Maurice McGonigal's son, Mirish McConnell, and his grandson, Fiach, who we're working with on a project in Paris. And so from the different sides of the different equations, because Mirish took the side of the Free State and my father took the anti-treaty side. And the brooch that you see there is one of 3 and he gave them to me when he knew he was near his end. And he made it from a spoon and a photograph that he got in the library of what a Tara brooch was like. And they are remarkable pieces. I asked him how he made it with a nail and his shoe. And he took great thing in that he had whipped the spoons from the dining hall and turned them into this, because he said the biggest problem you had locked up with others was everybody in on top of you, and that you needed space. And you either had physical space or you created it by doing something that distracted you from your colleagues beside you. So he kept his sanity, but in that view, there was a romanticness about it. There was a romanticness about heroic nationalism. And this picture of the men from the south, I'm always amused. In my day job, it was one of the paintings that we used to have to move around as percent for the art, depending on which minister we had. And if we had a minister from Fine Gael, take that picture out of here. And if it was Fianna Fáil, I want that picture in here. And that actually, the last time we moved, it was 2012. So you could guess on what was going to happen each time. So the element of the fire, and I show you this one, which is the Custom House, because my grandfather was B Company 1st Battalion, and they were organised geographically. So he was from Dorset Street over to here. So within that area, that unit was responsible. But he also was responsible for setting a torch to the Custom House as part of the group that did that, because it was all the different groups did that at one time. Now, lots of people say that was a mad thing to do because a whole lot of them got captured, but it did bring the British to the negotiating table within 4 weeks. In this, the Civil War element side of things, it was the loss of that whole idealism. And the only time I could get my grandfather to talk to me about it was near when he was very old and close to death. And he still wouldn't talk. And the information I got was from my grandmother, who survived him by quite a time. And I used to do her garden for her. And I said to her, "I'm not doing your garden now unless you tell me some of this history." And reluctantly, she did so. And then eventually I got her to flow with the information. And I kept notes of that. And I'm very delighted I did, because within 6 months of me doing that, she passed away suddenly. And that was then all lost. But the information I draw on, so it's part folklore of the family and part history of the information that I know. So my grandfather came down, was involved with the first group that occupied the forecourts. He was sent home by Sean Lamass because he had a young child and said, "Listen here, you need to be home with your family." But the morning the shelling started, he decided to up and out and was gone when my granny woke up, and with a note stuck on the inside of the door, "I'm off." And it's astounding that a young man of 21 leaves his family and wife to go off. And he took over Hammond Hotel in O'Connell Street and was there in the fighting that occurred there. it's an astounding situation. He managed to escape from there before the Free State Army got him, and he went into North County Dublin, where his family originally was from, out in Lusk. And out there he hid for quite a while, came back to Dublin, and managed to get back in and meet the wife, who wasn't too pleased to meet him, and let him know so. And he, as part of that, there was a number of connections that are very unusual. Thomas Ashe, who's there on the left hand, on your left, was a friend of my grandfather. He taught him in school for part of time in Lusk, because my grandfather moved between Dorset Place, where he grew up, to his grandfather out in Lusk, which was the Cardiff School, where Ashe was principal. And he knew him. And Ashe and O'Casey, who is the guy on the furthest on the right, were close friends, which is unusual, because O'Casey didn't have much time for nationalism. And when Ashe died, he published 2 books on him in 1917 and 1918. So when Ashe was arrested in the summer of 2017, he died because they tried to force feed him, and they made a mistake, and instead of putting the thing into his stomach, they put it into his lung, and he died. My granny and granddad are there just in from the left, and their wedding, and they married in England, because he was on the run here in Dublin at the time. And they came back, and they got a place through the link with O'Casey and Ashe in the house in North Circular Road. And O'Casey was on the ground floor, and they were in the basement. And O'Casey was to prove a key thing, because when my grandfather came back from North County Dublin and was staying in the North Circular Road, he was only there one night when the Free State Army kicked in the basement door and beat him to a fairly good pulp. And the only thing that saved him was O'Casey came home at 2 o'clock in the morning, heard the rumpus downstairs, went down, and he was a man who was confident in himself. He was 38, 39, and he was dealing with guys who were much younger than him. And he told Emmett Dalton, who led the group, if this man disappears, I know you are behind it. And that's the reason I'm here, because 9 months later, my granny gave birth to my mother. And I said to her, my granddad is either Sean O'Casey or granddad. At which thing she took grave exception, because she was a very Catholic view of the world. So he also used to give them free tickets to the projects, and she was at the riot in the Abbey when the Shadow of a Gunman was played and other plays. But she was delighted. She used to do typing for O'Casey, because when she was 10, she was orphaned, and she was sent off to a convent in Selbridge, where at the age of 10, the nuns put her out to do work in the houses around for her keep. At the age of 16, she came back to Dublin and took her other 2 siblings out of foster cares and looked after them in Molesworth Street during 1916. So she had very good time for O'Casey, and she gave me lots of information about him. And I contacted the O'Casey family, and they gave me other information. And the one that sticks with me is that on the morning that Michael Collins, was to be buried in end of August, O'Collins came down to her and had a cup of tea with her. And she said, even though she would have been more the Republican view, it was terrible that Collins had been killed. And she said, my man, Sean O'Casey, who was a Connolly man, just said back to me, Ireland thinks too much of its dead and not enough of its living, and proceeded to talk to her about another matter, where everybody else was in a state of shock about it. And she said, I never could understand why Sean took that view, but O'Casey obviously had a very strong view. And the reason why the picture for the Commemorating is that just after he got beaten up and taken away, my granny didn't know where he was for 3 weeks. And it was just at the time when the whole problems were developing, where the state was sanctioning execution without trial, and you had the irregulars shooting people in retaliation, and the whole thing was just in a spiral of negativity and destruction. And when my grandfather, he was captured and he was sent, she eventually found out he was in Kilmainham jail, and when he was released in 23, she got a note to say he would be released in what he was arrested in, which was a ragged pajamas and bare feet. And she went to get him over in the Kilmainham, and the door opened and he was just pushed out in his bare feet and his ragged pajamas. She'd known that was likely to happen because it had happened to others, so she had a coat that the Green Cross had given her and a pair of boots. And she said, we walked home to the North Circle Road, and about as we got to the house, his feet were giving him trouble because of the new boots. And he took off the boots and walked in his bare feet. And she said, he made a show of me. And I always thought my granny, in these sort of critical moments, would have the oddest sort of view, but obviously were very practical views. Now, the other side of the equation, and you see how this, when I get to the end, you see all of this ties together. Cosgrave and T.J. Byrne, who was the chief architect, who became the chief architect of OPW, knew each other from around 1904 and had been in contact with him. And when T.J. Byrne died suddenly in 1939 of a heart attack in work, Cosgrave wrote to his wife to say he was one of his oldest friends. And the key, one of the keys to getting this building rebuilt was that relationship. And I've seen the contact and the files that went back and forward between them. So he was key to that. And what was also very, if you look at the letter is from Reading detention camp in 1919, and here is Cosgrave writing to Byrne about housing for the future, of the slum clearances and stuff that should be done. Now, Cosgrave had been appointed by De Valera as part of the shadow government when they won the election in 1918 as Minister for Local Government and Development. And the grandson of T.J. Byrne told me that, and it only happened in Ireland, that both Byrne and Cosgrave would meet for a cup of tea as often as they could, at least once a week, where the shadow government would ask the formal government, because at this stage Byrne was the chief inspector of housing in the Custom House. He also told your man not to be in the Custom House when that fire took place. So it was a remarkable thing between each other. And when T.J. Byrne came from England, where he'd been born, he went and worked for a practice here and married the boss's wife, or daughter rather. So this was T.J. Byrne. This is what he did in London and in Ireland, and he did very good housing, still to be seen today, in Chapel Lizard and Mount Brown, and two Carnegie libraries, and one in Clondalkin and one in Ballyboden. And he was a remarkable man for the ability of work. He had a Trojan work ethic, and he had a career that covered 10 times what maybe other people would have done. And you have to realize at this time that almost 30% of Dublin was deemed to be a slum, and that meant one family in one room. And then coming back, as we circle back, the level of destruction. On the left-hand side, you can see O'Connell Street, the damage that was done there in 1916. Then you see the damage in Lower O'Connell Street in the 22 period, and then around the Custom House, or the forecourts rather, the damage that was done there. Now, when all that happened, it wasn't a unified voice about what should happen. And there was groups called the Reconstruction Movement, and they decided, well, we do up a plan of what should really happen, and they wanted to move everybody around the city. And forecourts would turn into an art gallery and a park. The new post office would be in the Custom House because it'd be close to a boat sailing down the Liffey. And City Hall would move to the old GPO as the new City Hall. And a new cathedral would be built at the top of Dame Street. All grandiose ideas, totally irrelevant from the point of view of whether the state could afford them or not. And contiguous with that were all the claims that were coming in. And so within OPW, we have within our old files all the claims people were making for the destruction of buildings. And the Law Society looks for £300,000 for the damage to the forecourts. and that was adjudicated on by OPW, and that was one of the things that Byrne used when he was arm wrestling with the Department of Finance. Listen, you're going to have to pay this if you don't let me do that, as well as getting Cosgrave to support them. And Mrs. Walpole, who was from 23 North Great George's Street, put in the sum of £1,500 for the loss of her son. So in those times, terrible times, you can see the value that was put on people and the value that was put on property. And they were the sums that were discussed at the time. So the Reconstruction Movement wanted different things, but Byrne took the view, well, listen, we've got all these things, we need to look at it properly. The forecourts had been started by Thomas Cooley in 1776, and he did the wings. And then Gandon was brought in, and Gandon did the key central bit and rejigged other elements. But what you see today is the external part of Cooley and Gandon, but the interiors, except for this space, are all T.J. Byrne. The aspect of the dome and all the elements that had to be done to it, there was roof lighting done to the new courts. The new Supreme Court was added on access to the main entrance. And there was what used to be in the old building, which was standard for the 1700s, was you went from room to room. There was no corridor. You just battled from one room into the next room, into the next room. And parts of Dublin Castle are still like that. So he then introduced corridors and the like into it. And you've seen that photograph before with Michael, the Public Records Office. It was done by another principal architect of OPW, Jacob Owen. And he also did the Law Library building as well, which was destroyed as well in 22. And if you look at that building, that is the Public Records Office, the interior of it on the left-hand side. So you had this stone outer front and stucco, and you had metal on the inside. And then what happened to the metal in the fire? It all collapsed. But I think a key photograph is the one on the lower right, where as you look like all that's left standing are the walls, and everything inside is cleared out. And that's why when he came then to look at it, he had to say, well, what do I do now? So the original forecourt plan was that, and you can see went on the wings sticking down like a fork to the ground. You went from one room to the other room to the other room. You didn't have the corridors. And if we compare that to Byrne's plans and all the changes that happened, he introduced corridors, he rejigged the use and the functionality of all the different spaces. The key forecourt element that we're in here was kept, but nearly all the other elements changed. The new Supreme Court was put in. So basically he had a framework and he filled it in a different way. So the interiors of the forecourts, with the exception of this space, is all T.J. Byrne. This is recreated by T.J. Byrne. And what did we have to do then? All these lost details, if you take a look at the picture on the top left, this was information shown to me by Colin, who I see this evening, in the architectural archive, which shows all the original elements that were within this building. There was, in these recesses, there was friezes, and they covered elements of showing the end of the Brehon laws and the whole chronology of conquest and colonization that occurred. And the original drawings for them we still have in the archive, and they're on that table. And so all of those elements were there. At least we have that as a record. But the place had been so damaged by the fire that this had been lost. Now, if you look at the cross section on the right, that's based on an etching. It's after Gandon's drawing, but it's not actually his drawing, but it's a beautiful etching from the early 1800s. And what's interesting in it is that it shows you the oculus and up here in the dome. And what used to happen was that when the legal people were leaving in the evening, they would put their books and their stuff onto little tables, and a thing of block and tackle pulled them up to that circular hole. And up above, which is this higher area here, is where they were stored. And the next morning when you came in, it would be dropped back down to you. So very handy way of saving you dragging your stuff around. And from that element, it was very, very useful. Now, the dome did get damaged quite a bit in the whole thing, because they had certain snipers there, and there was also people trying to dislodge them. And so one of the biggest problems, and Michael has alluded to, was what do you do? The engineers said, just flatten it, it's a waste of time. The building had actually shifted in one area off its foundation slightly, and other areas were in a state of tottering collapse. But Burns, who had a very good training as an architect, did calculations himself to say, no, I think I can make this work. And then engaged with Cosgrave and his own people within OPW and the Department of Finance, as you always have to do. And he decided, well, okay, let's start stabilizing it. So that's a photograph from the book of the clerk of works, of the work being done inside, of this trying to stabilize this actual space here. It's looking over to that wall over there. You can see the circular element is just behind us here. So they were wondering the whole thing, and you can see the size of the cracks running up the wall. Now, the other thing that happened was within the niches, you had different sculptures of the great and the good British judiciary. And it's funny enough, when you read some of the notes, these were unfortunately damaged beyond repair and cannot be reused. It was a euphemism, well, we can take them out without too much uproar. And someone actually jokingly said, why don't we do the same with Queen Victoria in front of where Dáil Éireann now is? But that didn't happen until 1948. So the whole element of all these destructions and elements, and you can see there where on the lower side they're trying to salvage materials, and that was because the state was virtually broke. So they recycled all the brick, all the stonework and all of that as part of the project. And T.J. Byrne was one of the key people to how to explain that and how to make it work. And that's what I call a poetic pragmatist. He actually solved the problem rather than bemoan what he had to do about it. And if you look then at the levels of destruction that were done to the building, it's very significant. And how was he going to stabilize all of that? And he decided, I'll make a new dome that sorts out this structure here. Because what the engineers were saying to him, the walls are so unstable, they're going to fall in, and unless you were to do something else. So he said, I'll do a dome in concrete. Now, if you think of it, reinforced concrete wasn't that common at that stage, and particularly not so in Ireland. And he designed all the reinforcement himself, because he wouldn't give in to the engineers who said it's a disaster. And it happened then in a few years later, he was actually asked to give a lecture in the Institute of Engineers, and he showed them the drawings and he showed them his calculations. And one of the attendants said, I never knew architects could design structure, but I'll have to give way to you, Mr. Byrne, in this instance. So he did the design, and then to make that happen, he had to do a huge amount of stuff. The concrete had to be poured in one go, and it took them 24 hours to do the whole thing. So there was a group of men working continuously, and they built a special lift to carry up the concrete in wheelbarrows with the guys to keep the thing flowing, because if one bit went off before the other, you wouldn't get the integrity of the dome. And then you can see the as we have it now today. And a little detail, and I see Audrey is here who's done the restoration work on it. Up on the top of the dome and the drum, they didn't have the money to do all the fixing. So you can see the column here on the right. The bit had been on the inside, was originally on the outside, and had been damaged by the fire and the elements. And so all he could afford to do was turn the bit around, because the bit that was facing into the building was less damaged, and he turned it around. And we got another 100 years out of it, so it's pretty good what he did. But he was that sort of inventive sort of man. And then the drawings that were done for the central hall and the forecourts. And there's a huge collection of drawings. There's a doctorate in it for somebody who wants to go through them all. And maybe when I retire, I might do it. But it's a situation of remarkable levels of detail that where every little detail was looked at. It wasn't just have a go at it. And then, of course, he had to come and talk to the Chief Justice of the day and convince them that this is what to do. It's a bit like we're going to have to do with the family court in Hammond Lane to describe the project. And he did these perspectives of what the different courts were going to be like. And what was different was he was introducing daylight through the roof, which up to that wasn't there. And people were in these dark rooms. And it was the case, even though lots of people now say Great Gandon, people gave out about that building for about 100 years, as they always do about any building. So the interiors that went in were significant. And they used a lot of Irish materials, and not just because of that time. From about 1890, there was a whole push to use Irish materials because of that thing of getting a share of the money being spent on public projects. And so he brought in Killaloo and Carrick-on-Shore slate and Kerry sandstone. So the linings that you have here is Kerry limestone on it. So all of those elements, and then when you look up or down, so that shot to the floor is taken through the oculus, and the other drawing is Byrne and his team's drawing looking up. And that was how they did all the elements and all the detailing that was done. And then that's the present day view of the building retrieved from oblivion, really, by TJ. And on the opening in 1931, in October 1931, the Chief Justice Hugh Kennedy complimented Byrne as for the work done, and he stated that what had been a dim and dark place to work was now full of light. So, times change, people change, and different views. And what I'm going to note as I come into the last little bit is to just show other things he did, because it showed how one thing fed into another. And this is the GPO, which originally was run by Francis Johnston, who would again have been principal architect of OPW in its earlier life as a board of works, because it changed in 1831 to the OPW. So that had all been looked after well, relatively speaking. And even on March 1916, a complete refurbishment had been done of the front of the GPO. And then 5 weeks later, it's flattened. So you can see the photograph at the top left, and then the same position of what was there left after 1916. And then the work he did to the hall and part of that. And I'm looking forward to getting that building back on post when they move, because we should get it back, I hope. And I'd want to now see what we can do with that, because what he did was very remarkable. Here's this pencil sketch of the building and looking up Henry Street. And what's very unusual about this, he also included shops into the design. So the ground floor of shops, he designed them into the building. He also, the first radio station, 2RN for Ireland, it was up on the first floor, and actually that was there until well into the 60s and 70s. And so he was very unusual like that, about thinking how things could be done and other things could be got. And on the right-hand side, the first use of a parabolic arch for the little arcade that runs through. And it was the first arcade done here. And then coming back around, I mentioned about the fire in the custom house, that the granddad had a part to do it. And that's the paper of the Irish Times just after that, talking about the destruction. And just to add to what Michael said about the fire brigade, I can consolidate that in that Lawless, who was one of the fire brigade guys in Tara Street, got a number of people out of the burning building of the custom house. 4 of the guys went in, they exchanged their fire brigade uniforms and gave it to the guys in there who were trapped by the auxiliaries. They got out, they were brought to Tara Street, had a shower, and took the tram out to Dún Laoghaire and went for a walk on the pier. At the same time, now, then the Black and Tans said, what's funny here? We saw 20 fire brigade guys and there's only 16, and where are the rest of them? And they then were suspicious, and in they went, and they got the 4 guys in who got a terrible hammering for having exchanged their clothes with the guys that were there. So moving on from that, the fire of that building showed all sorts of things, and some of the things he started to do here were able to be used in your restoration here. And the dome, and you can see the dome has disappeared after the fire. The fire raged for 3 days, and all the bronze door handles melted. So that meant the temperature got over 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, like a remarkable heat. It also caused some of the problems we still look at today, because the interconnecting pieces of stone with metal crampions, of course, were damaged by the fire and led to further corrosion, which had to be fixed. And again, if you look at the damage that happened where the lead and the copper melted and literally dripped down the wall on the left-hand side, and then the interiors were completely smashed to pieces. But if you compare the drawing then, what he did there was he got the building back together, added extra facilities, but they didn't have the funding to do the central bit on the right-hand side, and that disappeared, the long room of the custom house. And so he then restored the elements he could, and the elaborate amount of construction. He worked on designing even the scaffolding. So this guy was a guy who was just determined to get things to work. Anyone who said there was a problem, he would just sit down and determinedly work on it, even down to the sculptures that he saved on the exterior. Now, some of the, when you look at it, the darker part of the dome, it's Arbracken stone. He didn't have the funding to use Portland stone, which was on the rest of the building. And, you know, that was the best he could do with that. Now, the thing that was lost in that central area, if you look at the lower image on the left-hand side, is a computer-generated model that we've done of the building as it exists. And there's this big hole there, which was the long hall. And the long hall didn't get replaced. They put a boiler house, unfortunately, in it in 1922. And we're doing the master plan now for its next 100 years. And I call it my Book of Atonement for my grandfather, although I would have done the same as he had done. And what we're going to do is we're not going to make a replica. We're going to do a new element that responds to the original proportions of the building. And it'll be an outward-facing gallery that the people can come in off the street of the walking by the river, enter into what already OPW has as a visitor centre, enter into this, and this can be exhibitions and all sorts of other elements. And we're now in the process of getting the funding for that. So I jokingly call it my Book of Atonement, and on the top left is the visualization of what was the Great Hall. And so we give that back and give that building another 100 years, as well as doing all the other things that need to be done. And then, lastly, coming full circle, I come back to the people I started with. You have T.J. Byrne in 1930s, a portrait that's down in the Architectural Archive. And he was a Trojan worker. He did huge amounts of work. He's a forgotten hero, really, because he was a quiet man. He got a heart attack in January 1939, and that robbed him of a lot of the credits he should have got for many things, including Dublin Airport. He had put together a team to work on the airport as a new building type, and Desmond Fitzgerald, who was one of the people he hired to work on it, later, when he left the OPW to take up professorship of architecture in UCD, took all the drawings out of OPW. And I only got a pair of drawings that were in a maintenance file. And that's where the drawings survived. And they were kept by Desmond Fitzgerald's family until I approached them a while back, and they have now given them back to OPW. So he was a forgotten hero. He did lots of things. In the center slide is my mother and her sister. We actually know the night she was conceived, because he was only back for one night and he was arrested later that night. So it was that or Sean O'Casey, as I say. So that was them in 1926. Now my grandfather, when he got out of Kilmainham, no government work. He had been excommunicated by the church because of the role he took and the views he took. And as he said, well, if they don't want me, I won't want them. But my good granny, who is there with the picture, was determined to get him back to the church. And she said to me, it took me 7 years to get him to come back. And how she did it was that when my mother and her sister, who were within a year of each other, making their Holy Communion, she said, you cannot let those children down. And he gave in at that point and went back to the church. Only on occasions, I might add, because I remember he was asked by my mother to bring me to church, and walking down the road, he said, "Would you like to go to the shops?" And of course, a little 5-year-old said, "I'll go to the shops." So, and I can remember that clearly because my mother interrogated him when he came back, and he admitted to bringing me to the shop, which led to absolute uproar in the house that Sunday afternoon. But he was a man who struggled in the 1920s. But then what happened in later, he had a stroke of luck. He had been working as a milkman, all sorts of odd jobs, and he bought a ticket in the sweepstakes in 1932, and lo and behold, he pulls a horse. And as he said himself, the nag we pulled out was 33-1, but luckily pulled up lame the day before, and you get compensation if the horse doesn't run in the sweepstakes. So if he had run and had come last, they would have got nothing, but they got compensation for that. And that was enough for them to buy a house, educate my mother and her sister and some other siblings, and that he then went on to open a small shop and do other things. And he took education very seriously. He wanted his children to be Irish speakers, all of those things that generation did. And it was remarkable. And he and I were each other's favourites, and you can see me there with him. It was a great honour for me to have him as a granddad. As a young fellow, I was always amazed how he could carve things with a penknife into all sorts of shapes. And he had learned that, he said, when he was locked up. And so, coming back, I'm the chief architect at the OPW now. I'm the grandson of a man who occupied the building. I had grandparents and parents who took education very seriously. And that is partly, I think, the story of us and part of that mosaic, I said. So thank you very much for listening. And it was a pleasure to be asked by the Chief Justice and Angela and the court service. And thank you to Lisa and Alan for the work. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Colin Dunbar, who helped me put together the slides and source some of them. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. I'd like to say a few words in conclusion. Firstly, to thank so sincerely Katrina Crowe, Michael Fewer and Ciaran O'Connor for speaking tonight, for struggling with a sometimes recalcitrant sound system, which gives the idea of the Battle of the Four Courts a whole new meaning. But I was particularly pleased that we had Michael and Ciaran, Michael discussing the destruction of the Four Courts and Ciaran discussing the rebuilding of the Four Courts. And whatever about what Sean O'Casey said about what we remember and what we commemorate, I think we don't give enough credit to the decision that was made here to rebuild the building in 1922. When you consider what was done on top of the old Public Records Office, we should be eternally grateful to T.J. Byrne and W.T. Cosgrave for the very brave decision at the time to spend what then was nearly 9 years rebuilding and reconstructing this building. And in keeping with that theme, I was fascinated also to hear how Katrina Crowe spoke so passionately about the destruction of the archive in the Public Records Office, but also of the extraordinary exercise that has been carried out in the Beyond 2022 project to reconstruct and restore so many of the documents and make them available digitally that we thought were lost in that archive. This is a key point in the Decade of Commemoration series, in the lecture series that has been run. It's a centerpiece with the opening of the exhibition, and we are now only days away, as it were, 100 years ago from the commencement of the Battle of the Four Courts. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everybody involved in this exercise. Michael Fewer, who helped with the creation of the exhibition, and I'd also like to thank the Office of Public Works in Vine Hall and the institutions who have given us some of the photographic and video materials. And one of the interesting things about this exercise is that people came forward during the lecture series with connections to the occupation of the forecourts, and gave us some of the artifacts that are now exhibited in the exhibition. And I'd like to thank therefore the Butler family, Fergal McCabe, Dermot O'Connor and Con Brogan, who have provided support, artifacts and photos and the relevant permissions to allow us to tell the story in the visual representation that you see around the hall. We were also very keen that this process would open up the forecourts and would be available to more than the lawyers who come in here every day. And one of the really exciting things that has been done is the launch of the app, which you'll find at Forecourts 100 at all good app stores. And I hope you download that, and that will be a continuing resource that will allow people both in the forecourts and at home to take a tour of the forecourts to see some of the really fascinating footage and photographs and information that go to enhance the story, some of which you've been told tonight. And I'd like to thank NoHo, who developed the app and worked closely with the team. I'd also like to particularly thank the Decades of Commemoration Committee, which is made up of present and former staff in the court service and judges from every jurisdiction in the courts. And it has been a wonderful collaborative exercise as far as we are all concerned. And it really illustrates the fact that I think that everybody in this process, everybody in this building, is really working on trying to do the same thing, which is the not particularly easy task of the administration of justice without fear or favour or ill affection or ill will. But in a way, everyone is trying to do that job, and the Decade of Commemorations Committee is a sort of illustration of the way that task crosses jurisdictional boundaries and involves the court service staff just as much as judges. And I'd like to thank all the members of that committee for what they have done and the enthusiasm they have shown throughout this project. One other thing to say is that there's one other really interesting lecture in our current run of the series. I can see Angela Blanche at the idea that there might be another run of lecture series, but that's to be given on the 7th of July by Dr. Blonner Owan SC in relation to the fate of the judges who were occupying the beautiful building, or thought they were occupying the beautiful building up to 1922, and the legal profession generally. Now, just I suppose in conclusion, I should say it'll probably come as no surprise to those of you who read my judgments that I know some things and there are lots more that I don't know. And there were things I thought I knew about this, and which this whole process has taught me how little I did know. I thought I knew and did know about C.P. Curran, who was a registrar in this building, a distinguished architectural historian, and a very significant figure, a contemporary of James Joyce, Hugh Kennedy, James Murnaghan and Tom Kettle, who wrote a beautiful memoir of James Joyce's time in university, and also a really interesting memoir of some of those individuals. But what I didn't know, and he went on to be the registrar of the Supreme Court, but what I didn't know was that he took it upon himself to come into the forecourts during the occupation to speak to Rory O'Connor and to insist or to try and persuade him of the importance of maintaining the archive. And he then was the first person on the scene in the immediate aftermath and to see the destruction, and had the melancholy duty of reporting to Michael Collins that everything had been destroyed beyond salvation. I knew that the destruction of the Public Records Office was a great national tragedy, but what I didn't know until this whole process was just what a beautiful building it was. And you can see that from some of the photographs that Michael showed us, and you can see it on the app and also in the little trailer that's included in the app of the Beyond 2022 exercise, which brings you on a virtual tour through this absolutely beautiful building that contained the treasures of Ireland. I knew about some of the work that was done, but what I didn't know was that Samuel Ferguson was the first, I think, person in charge of the Public Records Office. I've forgotten his arcane title, and that he was a distinguished poet had a huge interest in the Irish language, but was a Protestant from Belfast, and I'm proud to say that, coming from Belfast myself, and I'm also delighted to welcome our friend, Mr. Justice Adrian Colton of the Northern Ireland Courts here. And I did not know something else when I talk about my own history. I was very interested in what Ciaran said, and also in what Professor Ewan O'Halpine earlier in the series mixed the family with the history. And as it turns out, my maternal grandfather was in Ballykinler with Ciaran's grandfather and Maurice McGonigal and a few others indeed. I think Joseph McGrath, who set up the sweepstakes that saved the O'Connor, or created the O'Connor family, set them on their feet. And my grandfather was a first cousin and close friend of Liam Mellows, so it's not a case simply that I come to work in this building, but we always had in our family the history of that connection. Now, when I said that to my friend, Mr. Justice Maurice Collins of the Court of Appeal, he said, "I'll see your first cousin thrice removed and raise you a granduncle." But I had always the impression, and did have the impression, that that Liam Mellows was somewhat rigid in his views, was something of a firebrand, a diehard, and a man that was perhaps difficult to sympathise with. But I was delighted then to find in Michael Fewer's book the reference to in Todd Andrews' books to Liam Mellows as a low-sized man with thinning sandy hair, merry blue lively eyes. The man's whole personality radiated kindness. And in a new historical approach, which I'm going to pioneer tonight, of reverse DNA, I can say that if my mother and her family were anything to go by, that is an accurate description. And it's that nuance and information and detail which I personally have found so interesting in this exercise. And I love the stories of J.J. Ginger O'Connell playing bridge with his captors. I like the idea of the young men, and that's what they were, young men and women in here, sitting around here perhaps playing games and singing and having entertainment and allowing people to come in and out. And I particularly like the idea that they, for a long time, this occupation was a sort of play acting at war. And I like the idea, as I say, that they went out for drinks with the National Army friends who were outside, which brings me, I suppose, to the conclusion tonight, which is that for a long time, the occupation of the Four Courts between April and June, it wasn't really a very dangerous place to be. In fact, it strikes me when we talk about the drinking that I am now in a more dangerous place tonight, because I am standing between an Irish audience and the prospect of refreshment on a Friday night. And so I'd just like to invite you to have refreshment with us. I'd like to thank Maura and Hal particularly, and all the team who have put this together and worked so hard on developing not just tonight but the whole lecture series, the exhibition, the app, the interaction with the schools. It has been a wonderful thing, and it's something that we hope to build on and develop. But for the moment, simply thank you very much for coming tonight, and see you at the next event. Thank you.